Good morning, everybody. In this presentation, I would like to present a critique of the European Union's revised Renewable Energy Directive and the delegated regulation supplementing the directive. I will start with a brief presentation of the background that led to this study. Then I will present the legislative framework of the directive and the delegated regulation. I will discuss the scientific basis of these documents and the inputs provided by life cycle assessment to quantify the impacts of different feedstocks used for biofuel production. And this will allow me to justify my critique and lead me to the conclusions. So let's start with the background. So we all know that decarbonizing all sectors of the economy is a key to address the current climate crisis. In 2009, the European Union has introduced a legal and policy framework to promote the use of the energy from renewable resources. In its core instrument, the Renewable Energy Directive, in its first version, so Red&Dr, seeks to prioritize the use of biofuel to reduce greenhouse gas emission in the transport sector. But following the debate on how to account for the indirect land use changes effect of biofuels in 2008, the new European Union rules on biofuels have led to mounting tensions between the EU and some of its trading partners. A particularly contentious measure is the so-called freeze and phase out of certain biofuels in the transport sector with a high indirect land use change risk. This is the key aspect for assessing which crops have a high indirect land use change risk is how do we define high indirect land use change risk. In March 2019, the European Commission published the delegated regulation, which supplements the directive regarding how to determine low and high indirect land use change risk associated with the expansion of a certain feedstock. So what is the problem with this? The problem is that following this framework, it seems like palm oil is the only high indirect land use change risk crop in the world. So it is worth noticing that palm oil is not produced in the European Union, and it is instead produced 85% of it in Malaysia and Indonesia, especially in Indonesia. As a consequence of this, Indonesia pushed a legal action against the European Union and the World Trade Organization because it sees this as a protectionist measure, followed by other palm oil producing countries in the world, such as Malaysia, Colombia, and Costa Rica. So what I would like to discuss, and the question I would like to answer in this presentation, is how do the directive and the delegated regulation define high and low indirect land use change risk crops. Before moving forward, I think it's useful then to repeat here what are the definitions of direct and indirect land use change. Direct land use change takes place directly in the occupied land as a consequence of change in the land use type. On the other hand, the indirect land use change is an entirely different concept. It is caused every time we demand the land as an input of production. Even when the land is already in use for agricultural purposes, the demand for that land will displace the current production taking place in that land, which will have to occur somewhere else in the world. This triggers the domino effect, ultimately ending with an increase in virgin land converted to agricultural practices. It is, of course, difficult to model where this conversion will take place, but this aspect is definitely non-negligible and must be accounted for. So our hypothesis is that both the RED2 and the delegated regulation ignore the cause-effect relationship that lead to indirect land use changes and address it instead as a direct land use change. The greenhouse gas emission associated to the production of the same crop can fall within a very broad range, even within the same country, depending on aspects such as the yield, the presence of greenhouse gas emission mitigating option, and nature conservation activity carried out in combination with the agricultural production. Therefore, land use policies based on generic, national, or global data on land use change factors calculated based on direct land use changes do not differentiate between product systems and can lead to the exclusion of entire countries and crops, regardless of the actual greenhouse gas emission per unit of product caused by a specific product system. We also claim that, hypothesize that the directive and the delegated regulation seem to explicitly target palm oil, appearing more as a protectionist measure rather than a roadmap to reduce the greenhouse gas emission in the transport sector. To analyze the scientific basis of the directive and the delegated regulation, we reviewed these documents in depth, and we also reviewed the Global Biosphere Management Model, better known as GLOBIOM, developed since the 2000 by the International Institute for Applied Analysis, which was also applied to quantify the land use change greenhouse gas emission in 2 studies commissioned by the European Union to support the drafting of the RED II. Based on the review, we highlight the limitation of the RED II and the associated delegated regulation in setting the criteria for reducing the indirect land use change of biofuels. These documents are long and very hard to read. Here, I would like to show you only 2 key core articles, one for the directive and one for the delegated regulation. For the directive, Article 29, which states that biofuels shall not be made from agricultural biomasses obtained from land with high biodiversity value, such as primary forests, or from agricultural biomasses obtained from land with high carbon stock, such as wetlands. So there is clearly a focus on the direct land conversion. So if a biomass it is directly causing that land conversion, that biomass is deemed a high indirect land use change risk, although this has nothing to do with indirect effect. It's completely focusing on the direct effect. So this is a key limitation and confusion in this framework. And the second article is Article 3 from the delegated regulation this time. It is actually where the criteria for determining the high indirect land use change risk feedstock it is described. And it is described in this way. So it is based on the average annual expansion of the global production area of that feedstock since 2008 until 2015. If it is higher than 1% and affects more than 100,000 hectares, then this crop is deemed high indirect land use change. So you can see here that there is exclusively a focus on the global production area. There is no difference between different regions and different production practices. It's simply like a global outlook, and it's based on data from 2008, so in the past, with absolutely no cause-effect relationship and link to what will actually happen today if we demand that crop produced by a specific product system. So the entire life cycle assessment approach based on the functional unity is lost, and also regional differences are completely lost. So in order to prove this, we performed a life cycle assessment to quantify the impact per functional unit, where the functional unit is 1 kilogram of vegetable oil, of the main vegetable oil sources, which are sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, and of course palm oil. Soybean oil is not present here because soybean oil is a byproduct of the soybean meal system, so it is not affected by an increase in demand of vegetable oils being a constrained resource because it's a byproduct. So the marginal source is instead, if we look at statistics, is palm oil, which is the one will respond in a change in demand of vegetable oils. That's why we model only these 3 and we excluded soy. You can also see here that the difference between certified and non-certified palm oil, where we here look at the RSPO certification scheme, which is a scheme to reduce the greenhouse gas emission from palm oil production. It's very high. It is also very high within RSPO, whether we assume we look at the best-in-class RSPO certified production or an average one. So there is clearly a difference in the production practices. They matter. But also we see that the difference between palm oil and the other vegetable oil is actually not that big, while the study commissioned by the European Union to support the update of the RED I claimed that palm oil was 3.5 times higher than the emission were 3.5 times higher than the other vegetable oils. In this slide, I would like also to briefly show that the contribution analysis for these results. You can see, for example, that the impact of peat in black is very significant. So if peat is avoided, the impact is dramatically lower. And this is also completely ignored by the delegated regulation in how we assess the high risk of indirect land use change. So the focus on the emission is completely lost. So what are the conclusions? The conclusion are that the European Union Renewable Energy Directive and the associated delegated regulation fail to distinguish between direct and indirect land use changes. They set criteria for determining the indirect land use change risk based on the direct land use changes, although these are completely different concepts. It is also based on past data and past changes with no cause-effect links with actual consequences of changing current demands. The criteria do not account for the actual indirect land use change effects triggered when demanding the production capacity of land at the global level. Moreover, the criteria fail to assess the environmental impact of different product systems because the assessment is done at country level based on past direct land use change data. So the criteria fail to distinguish between different production practices. There is also therefore a risk that they compromise the effort made by a certified producer in Southeast Asia to reduce the greenhouse gas emission of oil palm, which is the oil crop, by the way, with the highest yield and therefore the lowest indirect land use change per unit of product. With that, I would like to briefly show you some references I have used during my presentation, and thanking you for your kind attention.